When we hear the name Cleopatra, we imagine the last pharaoh of Egypt draped in gold, a woman whose beauty and brilliance seduced the greatest men of Rome. But Cleopatra the Seventh, Philopator, was far more than a temptress. She was a master politician, a cunning strategist, and a ruler who understood power better than almost anyone of her age. To truly understand her, we must start at the beginning, not with the dramatic romances with Julius Caesar or Mark Antony, but with her childhood in a royal family where survival itself was never guaranteed. A queen whose mind could outwit the greatest politicians of her age, and a ruler whose very name, 2,000 years later, still echoes with mystery, power, and desire. She was the last pharaoh of Egypt, the lover of Rome's two greatest men, a queen, a mother, a warrior, and a master of survival. This is not just the story of a beautiful woman. This is the story of one of history's greatest minds. This is Cleopatra, the woman who became legend. Cleopatra was born in 69 BCE into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a royal house that traced its origins back not to Egypt, but to Greece. This is where her story begins, with a family of foreigners ruling as pharaohs in the land of the Nile. The dynasty was founded by Ptolemy the Soter, a general and close friend of Alexander the Great. After Alexander's death in 323 BCE, his empire was divided among his companions. Ptolemy seized Egypt and crowned himself its ruler. Though the Ptolemies had been in power for nearly 300 years by the time Cleopatra was born, they were always somewhat outsiders in the eyes of their people. They ruled Egypt, but they spoke Greek, lived by Greek customs, and often married within their own bloodline to preserve power. The Egyptian language, culture, and traditions were something many Ptolemies only performed as a political act, not something they truly lived. Cleopatra, however, would be different. She became the first Ptolemaic ruler to learn the Egyptian language fluently, along with several others. This detail matters because it showed how she thought differently from her ancestors. She did not want to be seen as a foreign ruler. She wanted to be a pharaoh in the truest sense, connected to both her Greek heritage and her Egyptian subjects. Cleopatra was the daughter of Ptolemy the Muktith Auletes, sometimes called the flute player, because of his love for music. Ptolemy the Muktith was not a strong ruler. In fact, he was more famous for his love of luxury and dependence on Roman support than for any real leadership. Rome at this time was expanding aggressively, and for Egypt to survive, alliances with Roman leaders were crucial. Her mother's identity is less certain. Most historians believe Cleopatra's mother was Cleopatra V Tryphena, one of Ptolemy XIII's wives. Some scholars, however, suggest her mother may have been a secondary wife or concubine. What we do know is that Cleopatra was one of several siblings, including two older sisters, Berenice IV and Cleopatra VI Tryphena, and two younger brothers, Ptolemy the XVIII and Ptolemy the XVIII. This family dynamic was dangerous. In the Ptolemaic dynasty, sibling rivalries often turned deadly. Brothers and sisters fought for power, plotted assassinations, and waged civil wars against each other. Cleopatra grew up in an atmosphere where loyalty to family was never guaranteed, and where betrayal could come from within her own palace walls. The royal palace in Alexandria, where Cleopatra grew up, was no ordinary home. Alexandria was the most cosmopolitan city of the ancient world, a hub of trade, learning, and culture. Its great lighthouse, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, guided ships into its busy harbor. The city's crown jewel was the Library of Alexandria, a treasure house of knowledge that drew scholars from every corner of the known world. Imagine young Cleopatra in this environment. While most royal children might have been taught only the basics of court life, she had access to the greatest minds alive. Tutors and philosophers surrounded her. She was trained in rhetoric, science, philosophy, astronomy, and medicine. She absorbed languages like a sponge: Greek, Egyptian, Latin, Hebrew, Aramaic, and possibly even Persian and Syriac. By adulthood, she may have spoken as many as 9 languages fluently. This multilingual ability was more than just an intellectual achievement. It was a political weapon. Most rulers communicated through translators, which created barriers. Cleopatra could speak directly to foreign envoys, priests, and generals. She could charm them, persuade them, and negotiate without intermediaries. It made her stand out instantly in a world dominated by men who underestimated women. As Cleopatra was growing up, Rome loomed larger and larger over Egypt. Her father, Ptolemy the Theme, was deeply unpopular among Egyptians because he relied heavily on Roman support to keep his throne. He paid Rome enormous sums of money, draining Egypt's wealth to secure his position. At one point, when he was expelled by his own people, it was the Roman army that restored him. This dependence on Rome planted a seed in Cleopatra's mind. She must have watched as her father begged for Roman assistance, understanding that Egypt's independence was fragile. Rome was not just a distant power, it was the looming force that could make or break her family's rule. Cleopatra's early life was shaken by conflict. When her father was overthrown in 58 BCE, her older sister Berenice IV took the throne. Ptolemy XIII fled with Cleopatra into exile, leaving Berenice to rule in his absence. This was Cleopatra's first real taste of how unstable her family's power was. Life in exile was not glamorous. They lived in Rome for a time, where Cleopatra observed firsthand the political machinery of the Republic. She must have watched the senators, the consuls, and the generals, learning the intricacies of Roman politics. When her father finally returned to Egypt in 55 BCE with Roman backing and reclaimed his throne, Berenice IV was executed. Cleopatra, still only a teenager, witnessed how ruthless survival in her dynasty could be. By the time Cleopatra was a young woman, she had already seen her family torn apart by betrayal, her country's independence threatened by Rome, and the deadly consequences of palace intrigue. She was intelligent, ambitious, and cautious. Unlike her predecessors, she was determined to forge her own path. Historians believe Cleopatra learned to present herself not just as a ruler, but as a living goddess. Egyptian pharaohs were seen as divine, and Cleopatra embraced this tradition fully. She associated herself with the goddess Isis, the mother figure and protector of kings. In art and coinage, she often appeared with symbols of Isis, presenting herself as the embodiment of Egypt itself. This was more than symbolism, it was strategy. By linking herself to Isis, Cleopatra united her Greek royal heritage with Egyptian religious tradition. She became both the daughter of Ptolemy and the chosen of the gods, something her subjects could rally behind. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XIII, died in 51 BCE, leaving the throne to his 18-year-old daughter and her younger brother, Ptolemy III, who was about 10 years old. Following the Ptolemaic custom, Cleopatra was forced to marry her brother and rule jointly with him. But Cleopatra was not interested in being a ceremonial figure. She wanted real power. From the very start of her reign, she asserted herself in ways that shocked the court. Instead of appearing as just the junior partner to her brother, Cleopatra signed official documents with her own name alone. She issued coins with her face, not his. She presented herself as the sole authority in Egypt. This was the beginning of a struggle that would define her early reign, a battle between Cleopatra and her younger brother for control of the throne. When Cleopatra became queen in 51 BCE, she was 18 years old, intelligent and determined, but trapped in a tradition that bound her to her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy III. According to the customs of the Ptolemaic dynasty, royal siblings married each other to preserve the bloodline and keep the throne within the family. For Cleopatra, this was not a marriage of love. It was an obligation, a symbol meant to project unity to Egypt. But unity did not last long. Almost immediately, a struggle began between Cleopatra and her brother's advisors. Ptolemy XIII was too young to rule on his own, but his court guardians, powerful men like Pothinus, the eunuch regent, and Achilles, commander of the army, resented Cleopatra's independence. They expected her to be a silent queen, overshadowed by her child husband. Cleopatra, however, had no intention of disappearing into the background. She appeared on coins with her face alone. She issued royal decrees without her brother's signature. She presented herself as pharaoh in her own right. For the conservative courtiers around Ptolemy III, this was intolerable. By 49 BCE, only 2 years into her reign, the tension had escalated into open conflict. Cleopatra's grip on power began to slip as her brother's advisors rallied support against her. The Nile Delta was in crisis. A series of bad harvests had led to famine, and the people blamed the instability of the royal court. Cleopatra raised taxes to stabilize Egypt's fragile economy, but her decisions were unpopular. Her enemies used this as fuel, painting her as ruthless and uncaring. By the end of 49 BCE, Cleopatra was forced to flee Alexandria. Her younger brother, backed by his advisors, seized power for himself. Cleopatra retreated east, likely to Syria, where she began raising her own army. She would not go quietly into exile, not after everything she had endured as a child. She had seen her father overthrown and restored, and she knew that survival meant fighting back. At the very same time, the Roman world was tearing itself apart in a civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, two of the most powerful men Rome had ever produced. Their conflict would spill into Egypt and change Cleopatra's destiny forever. In 48 BCE, after being defeated at the Battle of Pharsalus, Pompey fled to Egypt seeking refuge. He believed the young Ptolemy III would welcome him as a Roman ally. Instead, Pothinus and the boy king ordered his execution. Pompey was murdered on the shores of Egypt, stabbed to death by former allies, his severed head presented to Caesar as a supposed gift. But this gift horrified Caesar. Pompey had once been his son-in-law, and killing him in such dishonor angered the Roman general. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria later that year, he demanded an audience with the royal family. It was at this moment that Cleopatra saw her chance. Cleopatra knew that if she could win Caesar's support, she could take back her throne. But how could she reach him? Alexandria was controlled by her brother's forces, and she had been declared an enemy of the state. The story that comes down to us, preserved by Plutarch, is one of the most famous in history. Cleopatra had herself smuggled into Caesar's presence, rolled up inside a carpet, or perhaps a linen sack, depending on the version. When the carpet was unfurled before Caesar, out tumbled the young queen. This bold entrance was more than a stunt. It revealed Cleopatra's genius for theatrical politics. She understood symbolism. By arriving in such a dramatic way, she presented herself not just as a ruler in exile, but as a daring, resourceful queen who was willing to risk everything to meet the most powerful man in the world. And it worked. Caesar was captivated. Cleopatra was 21 years old when she met Julius Caesar, who was in his early 50s. Their relationship has been portrayed for centuries as a romance, and there is no doubt that Caesar was drawn to her. But to Cleopatra, this was not simply about love. It was about survival and power. She needed Roman backing, and Caesar was her best chance. Caesar, in turn, saw great advantage in supporting Cleopatra. Installing her as queen meant Egypt would be loyal to him, and he would secure the wealth and resources of one of the richest kingdoms in the world. With Caesar's support, Cleopatra regained her throne. Civil war broke out in Alexandria between Caesar's forces and those loyal to Ptolemy III. For months, the city was engulfed in chaos. Streets became battlegrounds, ships burned in the harbor, and even the legendary Library of Alexandria may have suffered damage during the fighting. Eventually, Ptolemy III was defeated. Accounts say that he drowned in the Nile while trying to flee. Cleopatra was restored as queen, now ruling jointly with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, though in reality she was the true authority. Cleopatra's alliance with Caesar grew stronger after the war. She gave birth to a son, Ptolemy XV, Philopator, Philometor Caesar, more famously known as Caesarion, Little Caesar. Although Caesar never officially acknowledged him as his heir in Rome and Egypt, Cleopatra declared him the son of the most powerful man on earth. For Cleopatra, this was a masterstroke. Her child was not just a prince of Egypt, he was linked to Rome itself. It strengthened her legitimacy and gave her dynasty a future beyond the fragile politics of Alexandria. Cleopatra also accompanied Caesar on a tour of the Nile, a kind of royal voyage that displayed her power and wealth to the Roman general. Imagine the spectacle. Cleopatra dressed as Isis, traveling in a golden barge, surrounded by attendants and music, while Caesar marveled at the majesty of Egypt. This was not only seduction, it was diplomacy, a display of Egypt's splendor designed to remind Caesar why she was worth protecting. In 46 BCE, Cleopatra traveled to Rome with Caesar. She lived in one of his villas and was present during his triumphs. To the Romans, this was shocking. A foreign queen openly living with their leader, even bringing along her child, was scandalous. Statues of Cleopatra were erected in Rome, and many senators feared her influence over Caesar. Though Caesar never married her, his relationship with Cleopatra caused tension in Rome. To some, she was a symbol of luxury and decadence, a dangerous distraction for their leader. To others, she was a sign that Caesar dreamed of kingship, of ruling not as a Roman consul, but as a monarch in the style of the pharaohs. Cleopatra's presence in Rome was cut short in 44 BCE, when Caesar was assassinated by Brutus, Cassius, and their conspirators. With her protector gone, Cleopatra quickly returned to Egypt with Caesarion. She knew Rome was once again unstable, and she would need to play her cards carefully in the years ahead. Caesar's death marked a turning point. Cleopatra had secured her throne with his help, but now she had to face a new political landscape. Rome was divided once again, this time between the forces of Mark Antony, Octavian, later Augustus, and Lepidus. The second triumvirate was formed, and Cleopatra would soon find herself entangled in another alliance that would define her legacy. But before Antony entered her story, Cleopatra had already proven her brilliance. She had survived exile, civil war, and assassination plots. She had captivated the most powerful man in the world and used her relationship with him not only for survival, but to elevate her position as a goddess queen of Egypt. This was the Cleopatra who would step onto the next stage of history, more confident, more ambitious, and ready to gamble everything once again. When Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, Cleopatra's future suddenly became uncertain again. She had lost her most powerful ally, the man who had restored her throne and shielded her from enemies in both Egypt and Rome. For a brief moment, it must have felt like history was about to repeat itself. The same kind of chaos that had nearly destroyed her during her brother's rebellion years before. But Cleopatra was not the same young queen she had been when Caesar first unrolled that famous carpet. By now she was an experienced ruler, a shrewd strategist, and a woman who had learned how to navigate the dangerous currents of Roman politics. She understood that Caesar's death would trigger a power struggle in Rome, and she prepared to make sure Egypt survived it. Cleopatra's greatest asset was her son, Caesarion. In her eyes, he was not just her heir. He was the son of Julius Caesar, the man who had ruled Rome like no one before him. Whether the Romans accepted this claim or not, Cleopatra declared Caesarion as Caesar's legitimate child and heir. This was bold, because in Rome, Caesar had officially named his adopted son and great-nephew Gaius Octavius, better known as Octavian, as his successor. Octavian was a teenager at the time, but he carried Caesar's name and the loyalty of many Romans. Cleopatra's insistence that Caesarion was the true heir put her on a collision course with Octavian that would eventually define the end of her life. Still, in the short term, Cleopatra had to focus on protecting her throne in Egypt. With Rome descending into civil war, she knew she needed to choose her allies carefully. In the years after Caesar's assassination, Rome was controlled by the Second Triumvirate, an uneasy alliance between Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus. While Octavian consolidated power in Rome, Antony took responsibility for the eastern provinces, including Egypt. It was in this context in 41 BCE that Cleopatra and Antony first met. Antony summoned Cleopatra to the city of Tarsus in Asia Minor. He wanted her loyalty, her wealth, and her ships to support his campaigns. For Cleopatra, this meeting was more than a political appointment. It was another life-defining opportunity. Cleopatra understood better than anyone that power was not just about armies and money. It was about image, spectacle, and persuasion. So when she sailed to Tarsus to meet Antony, she turned the encounter into a performance that would be remembered for centuries. According to Plutarch, she arrived on a magnificent barge. Its sails dyed purple, the color of royalty, its oars made of silver. Cleopatra herself was dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, reclining under a golden canopy, attended by servants dressed as cupids and nymphs. The relationship between Antony and Cleopatra quickly became more than political. Antony was married at the time, but that did not stop him from falling under Cleopatra's spell. What drew him in was not simply her beauty, but her intelligence, charm, and charisma. Ancient writers, even those hostile to Cleopatra, admitted that her true power was in her wit and her ability to make people feel important in her presence. For Cleopatra, aligning herself with Antony made perfect sense. He was one of the most powerful men in Rome, and unlike Octavian, he was willing to embrace the luxuries of the East. Together they formed not just a political alliance, but a personal partnership that would shape the destiny of both Egypt and Rome. After their meeting in Tarsus, Antony followed Cleopatra back to Alexandria, where they began a relationship that shocked the Roman world. For the people of Egypt, however, their union was a symbol of strength. Cleopatra was no longer alone. She had secured the loyalty of a Roman general with vast armies at his command. The two lived in splendor, hosting elaborate feasts, dressing as gods, and presenting themselves as rulers of a new age. One famous account describes the formation of a social club they called the Inimitable Livers, a group dedicated to extravagant banquets, drinking, and entertainment. But beneath the revelry, their partnership was serious. Cleopatra provided Antony with money and ships, resources he needed for his campaigns in the East. In return, Antony legitimized Cleopatra's rule and gave her a powerful Roman protector against rivals. Cleopatra's support paid off. With Antony's backing, she secured new territories for Egypt. Lands that had once been lost to the Ptolemies were restored, strengthening her kingdom's borders. Her children with Antony, Alexander Helios, Ptolemy Philadelphus, and Cleopatra Selene, were given grand titles and positions, further cementing the dynasty's future. In 34 BCE, Antony staged a famous event known as the Donations of Alexandria. In a lavish ceremony, Antony distributed lands across the eastern Mediterranean to Cleopatra and her children. Cleopatra was declared Queen of Kings, while Caesarion was proclaimed the legitimate son of Julius Caesar and co-ruler of Egypt. This public display was deeply provocative to Rome. To Octavian and his allies, it looked as though Antony was abandoning Roman traditions and placing too much power in the hands of a foreign queen. Back in Rome, Octavian was consolidating his authority. He portrayed Antony as a man corrupted by the East, seduced and weakened by Cleopatra. Roman propaganda painted Cleopatra as a dangerous temptress who had bewitched Antony, turning him against his own people. This was not just slander, it was a calculated political strategy. By making Cleopatra the enemy, Octavian could rally Romans around himself as the defender of traditional Roman values. Antony's partnership with Cleopatra gave Octavian the ammunition he needed to declare war, not on Antony directly, but on the Queen of Egypt. By the late 30s BCE, Cleopatra was at the height of her power. She ruled Egypt with Antony by her side. Her children had been granted kingdoms, and she was seen by her people as a living goddess. Yet she must have known that her position was precarious. Octavian was growing stronger, and Rome had never tolerated the idea of a foreign queen holding sway over one of their generals. Still, Cleopatra was not afraid of risk. She had built her life on calculated gambles, rolling herself in a carpet to meet Caesar, sailing into Tarsus as Aphrodite to captivate Antony, claiming her son as Caesar's heir against Roman opposition. Each time she had succeeded. Each time she had emerged stronger. But the final gamble was yet to come, and it would take place on the battlefield at a place called Actium. By the late 30s BCE, Cleopatra and Mark Antony were ruling as though they were monarchs of a vast Eastern empire. Cleopatra's children had been crowned with territories stretching from Armenia to Libya, and she herself was proclaimed Queen of Kings. But in Rome, Octavian was weaving a different story. To the Roman people, Octavian painted Antony as a traitor and Cleopatra as the source of his corruption. He claimed that Antony had abandoned his Roman wife, Octavia, Octavian's own sister, for the seductive Queen of Egypt. He spread rumors that Antony intended to move the capital of the Roman Empire to Alexandria, handing Rome over to a foreign woman. This was propaganda at its finest, and it worked. Antony and Cleopatra became villains in the Roman imagination. Octavian was into just rallying Rome against Antony. He was preparing Rome for a war of survival against Cleopatra. The truth was more complicated. Antony was still a Roman general, still loyal to Rome in his own way, but he was also deeply tied to Cleopatra. He had children with her, depended on her wealth, and shared a vision of ruling the East together. Yet he also held obligations in Rome, where his alliance with Octavian was crumbling. This divided loyalty made Antony vulnerable. Octavian, always the calculating politician, exploited it relentlessly. While Antony was distracted with wars in Parthia and political battles in the Senate, Octavian steadily built his power base. Cleopatra was not a passive partner in these years. She financed Antony's campaigns, outfitted fleets, and provided resources that Rome could not easily match. In Egypt, she ruled with authority and remained immensely popular. She understood the stakes. If Antony lost to Octavian, her own throne and her dynasty's future would vanish. It is also important to note that Cleopatra was not merely Antony's companion, she was his equal. Ancient sources hostile to her often claimed she manipulated Antony with her beauty, but the reality is that she brought wealth, legitimacy, and political vision to their alliance. Together, they represented a fusion of Roman military might and Egyptian splendor. The final break between Antony and Octavian came in 32 BCE, when Octavian read Antony's will aloud in the Roman Senate. In it, Antony requested to be buried in Alexandria beside Cleopatra. This was shocking to Roman ears. To them, it was proof that Antony had abandoned Rome for Egypt. War was declared, not against Antony directly, but against Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. This was a clever move. By framing it as a foreign war, Octavian avoided civil war rhetoric and instead positioned himself as the defender of Rome against an external enemy. The decisive confrontation came in 31 BCE at the Battle of Actium, a naval clash off the western coast of Greece. Antony and Cleopatra commanded a massive fleet, over 500 ships, while Octavian's forces, under the command of his general Agrippa, fielded a slightly smaller but more disciplined navy. For days, the two sides stared at each other across the Ionian Sea. On September 2nd, the battle began. Cleopatra was there in person, commanding part of the fleet alongside Antony. At first, the fight was evenly matched, but Agrippa's tactics began to turn the tide. His ships, smaller and more maneuverable, harassed Antony's larger vessels, cutting off supply lines and wearing down their formations. Then came the turning point. Cleopatra, commanding her flagship, suddenly broke through the Roman blockade and sailed out of the battle. Accounts differ on why. Some say it was prearranged, a signal for Antony to retreat. Others suggest she panicked. Whatever the truth, Antony made a fateful choice. Instead of rallying his men, he abandoned the fight and followed Cleopatra's ship. The sight of their leaders fleeing shattered the morale of Antony's fleet. Panic spread, discipline collapsed, and Octavian's forces gained total control. Actium was not just a defeat, it was the collapse of Antony and Cleopatra's power. In the months following Actium, Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Egypt. Their armies were broken, their resources drained, and their Roman allies deserting. Yet they did not immediately surrender. Cleopatra raised funds, fortified her defenses, and prepared for the inevitable Roman invasion. But Antony was spiraling. Once a proud general, he became consumed by despair. Ancient accounts describe him as withdrawn, depressed, and humiliated. Cleopatra, always pragmatic, considered every possible escape. Negotiations, bribes, even plans to flee eastward with Caesarion. By 30 BCE, Octavian marched on Egypt. His propaganda was complete. Rome saw Antony as a traitor, and Cleopatra as the dangerous foreign queen who had bewitched him. Octavian's forces entered Alexandria, and the last act of Cleopatra's life began. By the summer of 30 BCE, Alexandria was under siege. Octavian's armies had marched into Egypt, and Cleopatra and Antony were cornered in their palace. Their fleets were either destroyed or surrendered, and their soldiers were defecting. What remained was not a kingdom on the rise, but two rulers clinging to a fading dream. Cleopatra, still only 39 years old, faced the greatest crisis of her reign. For nearly 20 years, she had balanced on the knife's edge of survival, playing Rome's leaders against each other, using diplomacy, wealth, and sheer willpower to keep her throne. But now, there was no more room to maneuver. For Mark Antony, the end was unbearable. Once celebrated as one of Rome's greatest generals, he was now a broken man. Ancient sources say he drank heavily and sank into despair, while Cleopatra turned her attention to negotiations with Octavian. She knew Antony's fall was inevitable, but she still hoped she could save Egypt, or at least her children, by striking a deal. In secret, Cleopatra sent envoys to Octavian, offering him treasure and pledging loyalty if he would spare her dynasty. She even considered abdicating in favor of her son Caesarion, though she must have known that Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, would never tolerate a rival claiming Caesar's bloodline. In August of 30th BCE, the drama reached its climax. Cleopatra had retreated into her mausoleum, a grand tomb she had been preparing for years. She filled it with gold, jewels, and treasures, making it clear that if Octavian refused her terms, she would destroy her wealth rather than let him seize it. When Antony heard that Cleopatra had shut herself away, he misunderstood. He believed she had taken her own life. Consumed by grief and shame, Antony resolved to end his own. He fell on his sword, mortally wounding himself. But Cleopatra was not dead. When she learned of Antony's act, she sent for him. Bleeding and dying, Antony was carried into her mausoleum. In one of history's most poignant scenes, he died in Cleopatra's arms, urging her to save herself if she could. With Antony gone, Cleopatra faced Octavian alone. He entered Alexandria as conqueror, but he did not immediately execute her. Instead, he sought to parade her through Rome in his triumph, as a living trophy of his victory. For Cleopatra, this was worse than death. She met Octavian in person, dressed not as a defeated queen, but as a monarch, regal and proud. Ancient writers suggest she tried to charm him as she had Caesar and Antony before. But Octavian was not so easily swayed. He was cold, pragmatic, and determined to eliminate every threat to his power. He assured her of her safety, but Cleopatra was too shrewd to believe him. Cleopatra knew her fate. She would never be queen again, never rule as Isis incarnate, never live as anything more than a prisoner displayed before a Roman mob. That was not the ending she would accept. On August 12th, 30 BCE, Cleopatra ended her own life. The exact method remains one of history's great mysteries. The traditional story is that she arranged for a poisonous asp, a snake sacred to Egypt, to be smuggled into her chamber and allowed it to bite her. Other sources suggest she used poison concealed in a hairpin or ointment. Whatever the truth, she died quickly, surrounded by her two loyal servants. She was 39 years old. The last Pharaoh of Egypt was gone. When Octavian learned of her death, he was furious. He had wanted her alive for his triumph. But in a way, Cleopatra had won. She denied him the satisfaction of parading her as a captive, and she controlled the final chapter of her story on her own terms. Octavian ordered her buried beside Antony, honoring their bond in death, if not in life. Her son Caesarion was captured and executed. Octavian could not allow any rival claimant to Caesar's legacy. Her other children by Antony, however, were taken to Rome, where they were raised by Octavia, Antony's Roman wife. With Cleopatra's death, Egypt ceased to be independent. It was absorbed into the Roman Empire, becoming one of its richest provinces. Octavian returned to Rome as a hero, later taking the name Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. Cleopatra's death marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the pharaohs of Egypt. Yet her legend only grew. To the Romans, she was remembered as a dangerous temptress, a foreign queen who had lured two of their greatest men to ruin. To others, she was a symbol of defiance, a woman who dared to challenge the might of Rome and died on her own terms. Modern historians see her differently still. Cleopatra was not just a seductress, but a brilliant political strategist, a polyglot, and a ruler who understood the importance of image and propaganda. She preserved Egypt's independence for 2 decades in the face of Rome's expansion, something no other ruler of her time achieved. Her story is tragic, but also inspiring. She was the last of the pharaohs, a queen who played the game of empires and nearly won. More than 2,000 years after her death, Cleopatra remains one of the most famous women in history. She has been reinvented endlessly, in plays, operas, films, and novels. Some remember her for her beauty, others for her love affairs, but the truth is far richer. She was a survivor, a ruler, and a genius who shaped the destiny of nations. In the end, Cleopatra proved that even in an age dominated by men, one woman could bend the course of history, if only for a time.